So first of all, I'd like to thank Chain React for having me here and putting up this awesome show. And I'm just enjoying myself as much as you guys are, and it's been unbelievably awesome. Great job, all speakers. Great job, Infinite Red. Just love it. Love being here. So I'm going to be talking about the 10 lessons that I've learned building React Native apps. The funny story here is I think Jason, the panel host from a few hours ago, had a sneak peek with my slides, and he probably took some pointers. So a lot of this is already talked about a little bit. So nevertheless, it's perfect time to have a recap, because most of us have had the same 10 lessons, I guess. All right, so I'm going to be touching on a lot of those points. I'm Adhithi Ravichandran, and I'm a senior software engineer working for a healthcare startup in Kansas City called ReadyWiz Health. And what's cool about us there is we built critical healthcare scenarios on the mobile platform, both iOS and Android. So we take care of things like stroke, sepsis, cardiac arrest, and so on. And it's all entirely built in React Native, and that's how I'm a React Native developer. And here I am. I'm going to start with the first lesson, learn React. Now, some of you here are going to get pretty annoyed by this lesson and be like, duh, obviously, I'm going to learn React. But I didn't. So these are the 10 lessons I learned a hard way. So I'm sure there's somebody here who is going to get started with React Native before realizing that they need to learn React. So long story short, when I started working on React Native, I was from a completely different background. I was doing Java and C++, and then I got to work for the startup here, and I was asked to code React Native. So I had no idea what I was getting into. I did not know JavaScript, and I did not know React, and I was just going to start coding React Native. So that's not possible. So please learn React if you haven't learned React. The things that you really need to learn about are what is a props, what are state, lifecycle methods, and the composition model of React. And with React Native, you also need to know JSX, which is kind of optional in React, but that's how you code in React Native. The endpoint is basically think in React, and my advice would also be maybe code a couple apps in React and familiarize yourself with React, because React Native is essentially JavaScript and React. So learn that first, and don't be like me and jump in before you learn React. Lesson 2 talked about quite a bit in the last 2 days, navigation. Navigation is still evolving. I started coding React Native in 2016, and at that time, it was very, very difficult to understand what was going on, what was the library I needed to pick. And for those of you who are wondering what is this navigation we're talking about, it's basically the transition between the screens on your mobile app, right? It's the routing for your mobile app. There are so many screens you're going to have, even for a simple application. You press the home button, you go to the back button, and tons of screens. And navigation is really a very crucial piece of your application. And picking the right library is super important. And you may end up seeing all of these options. And don't get worried, because there are some cool options that you can solidify to. Don't freak out. Here are some of the libraries I've used, which are kind of irrelevant right now, but I still would like to mention kind of the journey. I used something called Navigation Experimental long ago, and it was an experimental library and got deprecated, so that's no-go. And then I used something called Navigator, gone. There was Navigation iOS. It was only for iOS, so don't use it. Then there was native navigation, which was, I think, by Airbnb, and they stopped support for that. So that's gone. And then there was React navigation. So this is where we ended up, finally. And we're using React navigation, and I guess it's in version 3.0 now. And it's super cool, and we've really enjoyed using React navigation. And a tip would be, if you'd like React navigation, you can also use a React Native router Flux along with it. It's kind of a wrapper. It's a wrapper around React navigation, and I've enjoyed using that because the APIs are just so much easier. And even if things were going to change in React navigation, when React Native router Flux upgrades, they're going to take care of it. So I've enjoyed using React navigation in combination with React Native router Flux. I should have added that on my slide. And if you're someone who really wants a complete native navigation on both your iOS and Android, you can go for React Native navigation. I've heard a lot of cool things about it, but I have not used it. I probably want to try that on a different project outside of my work. But you have two solid options, React navigation or React Native navigation. And just forget about the past and all the other Stack Overflow questions about navigation, and don't get confused. And that's the lesson about navigation. The next lesson was also talked by the panel quite a bit about state management. Well, in my experience, I do enjoy using external state management libraries like Redux and MobX. And the reason we use that is when you're complicated, your apps become very complicated. So when we started coding our app, it was just a prototype, and then it grew and grew and grew, and then we started passing all the props down to the children, and it kept growing and got complex to handle. And that's when libraries like Redux and MobX come in place. Now, we don't want a battle between Redux and MobX because they're both trying to solve the same problem. And as somebody else mentioned in the panel, it's really about the developer. Whatever you like, you can pick one of them. Redux does come with a lot of boilerplate, and MobX is kind of easier to pick up for a newbie. It has less of a learning curve. But Redux, again, has a lot of these community support, awesome developer tools, and things like that. So we chose to pick Redux for our application. And MobX also is awesome, so it's just really up to you. And of course, with the advent of Apollo and things like that, there are other options for you to take care of your state management as well. But do you always need state management? What are the signs that you really need state management? Like I talked about, if you have a lot of props passed through a hierarchy of components, it's probably a good time to consider state management libraries. You don't want to keep passing props down parent to child to child to child to child. If you have global components, let's say you have notifications, that is a good time to use a external state management library as well. Also, for instance, you have user information. Like, for example, in our app, we have patient info that we show across multiple container components. Maybe that's a good one for you to use Redux or MobX. Or you can use React hooks, maybe. I haven't dived too much into React hooks, but with the combination of context and React hooks, maybe you can do away with state management libraries as well. So whatever your choice is, think about it. If you're picking a library, just play with it a little bit and decide which one would scale for your application. All right. Another question from the panel again, should I use Expo or not? I'm a big fan of Expo as well. And Expo is awesome. It lets you build React Native apps super fast. So if you're building a rapid prototype or if you're building an app that needs to go real quick, Expo is the way to go. Even in your React Native official documentation, you'll notice that they have two ways of doing React Native. You can either use the React Native CLI or you use the Expo CLI. So it's just up to you. Some points to think about whether you want to use Expo or not. If you hate any of the build configuration that you have to deal with, go for Expo. You don't have to deal with any of that. And you use just JavaScript. If you're someone who doesn't want to touch native code, you just want to code, JavaScript, React Native, go for Expo. You won't even have access to the native code, so you're not going to touch that. No Xcode, no Android Studio. Life is just easy with Expo. And you can also publish over-the-air updates anytime, and it is super awesome. But there are times when you may have to say no to Expo as well. Expo could be restrictive sometimes, so it's good to know. Somebody mentioned that Expo has a list of things that you want to know before you use Expo and when to say no to Expo. So it is restrictive sometimes in the sense, like let's say you want to use a push notification service of your choice. You can do that with Expo. So if you have things like that, you may want to think about whether Expo is the right fit for your product. And it is kind of loaded with APIs that you may or may not use. That's just the way it comes out. It's kind of like a framework. So it may not be suitable if you have a super lean app. If that's your aim, maybe it may not work out. And also, they are working on it, and we've talked about it in the panel as well. Not all iOS and Android APIs are available today, but they're doing a lot of work towards that. So that's something to consider as well. So if you want access to a native feature like Bluetooth, I don't think Expo has support for that yet, and maybe it'll come in the future. So before you choose to use Expo or not, just kind of get your requirements nailed down and know what your app really needs, like what are the native features and things that you need to use to make that judgment. And again, the same thing where you can't change the native code. If that's something you really want to do, maybe Expo is not something you can pick. And of course, you can detach your app from Expo anytime. But again, it comes with the cost where you may have to plan for some kind of additional coding. So maybe the navigation changes, maybe the push notification changes, but you need to plan for that. Overall, you have your choice. You have Expo, with Expo, a React Native app, or an app without Expo. So it just really depends on your use case and your requirements, what are the native features you need, and things like that. So think about it before you say no or yes to Expo. All right. The next lesson is my favorite. Please don't postpone testing your Android devices. This is these two characters who are battling, and they're wondering, nope, iOS, nope, Android, nope, iOS. But remember, you're building a cross-platform application for both iOS and Android. That is why you pick React Native. If not, you would be an iOS developer or an Android developer. So keep that in mind and quit battling. From the experience I have, the areas where I actually notice problems is that most of the developers that I work with and in my team somehow have iOS devices, including me. And then what happens is we have our own personal device and we like to test on that because it's just easier. You can deploy it, test it, and you don't have to deal with other devices. So that is a problem because if you mostly have iOS, you're going to forget about Android. Another problem is that developers usually run only one emulator at a time. Now, the reason for that is also because the Android emulators, for some reason, are really slow. And I even hear noises from my laptop when I open up Android Studio. And that is true. I don't know why. It's just like that. And then what happens is it kind of reduces the developer velocity. So we're like, oh, close Android Studio, close that emulator, just open the iOS emulator. It runs smooth and fine. It's OK. The mistake is then you're assuming that it works on Android as well. So don't do that. A tip for that would be, what we do is we kind of rotate. Get your developers to sign up and say, OK, developer A, this week you're going to use an Android emulator. Developer B, this week you're going to use the iOS emulator. And then by the time the week is over, just rotate them. That way they don't feel bad. And keep doing that. So that way you can catch your bugs early on during development time at just that stage before you even go and deploy to the devices. I think some people touched this point. Many third-party libraries really don't support Android as well. And that also is because of the same reason that the overall React Native experience, for some reason, is just kind of better with iOS. So we need to change that at the developer level as well. And that's going to change the third-party libraries as well, because the people coding those libraries are doing the same mistakes. So we want to make sure that we kind of treat Android and iOS as equals and test Android devices along with your iOS devices. So some tips. One thing that really helped us is to automate both our iOS and Android releases. In the beginning, we just automated the iOS deployments, but then we just didn't care to automate our Android releases. So what then happened was we sent emails to our testers within the team to just download and install the Android APK. And that was an extremely frustrating experience to everybody, and they just quit testing Android. So don't be that person. Spend some time and figure out how to automate both iOS and Android. That way the testers feel nice to test Android as well. And also maximize your devices. Get your company or your team to buy as many devices as they can to test, especially for Android, because there's just so many devices that behave so differently when you test the code. For instance, the newer Android devices require more explicit permissions. Let's say you want to access the photo gallery. It works well with the older devices, but then when you go and try this out on a newer device, you're like, oh, I have to go update my build.gradle settings to give some more permissions. So these are things you encounter only when you try testing on different devices. If not, you would never discover those problems. So maximize the devices. And obviously, test early and often, test at the development stage, test at beta testing stages. So just make sure you keep testing both the devices equally as often as you can. And as we talked about, assign developers in rotation, even if they don't like it. You can rotate them later on, so that way you catch bugs during the development stage. Bottom line is treat them as equals as much as possible. That way you give your user a native experience on both iOS and Android, and everybody loves your app, not just iOS users. All right. As we're talking about testing, the next lesson we learned is on testing. I really like this quote by Henry Ford on quality means doing it right even when no one is looking. This is something that really rings a bell to me about software testing as well. Because we as software developers sometimes are overconfident. We're overconfident about when we can finish the project and how cool our code is. So we may say, hey, it's going to take me 2 days to finish this, but then it's actually going to take 2 weeks. Because you didn't account for testing, you didn't account for code reviews, you just talked about your coding, and you forgot about everything else. And that's okay, but the other problem that software developers are notorious for is also being overconfident about the code. But that's not good. You need to test your code and make sure it works before you are confident about it. So for React Native unit testing, we use Jest, which is super cool. And based on the State of JavaScript survey from 2018, it ranks as #1 among testing frameworks for JavaScript, followed by Mocha, Jasmine, and so many other cool frameworks. So make sure you write good unit tests, which is like the basic level of testing that you need to do for your code before you ship it. And we've had a great experience writing Jest tests for our React Native projects. How many of you use Jest here for React Native? Awesome. Everybody almost. Great. Cool. The next thing that I'd like to touch is end-to-end tests. We recently started doing that for our React Native app. And we use something called Detox. So Detox basically tests your mobile app while it's running on either a real device or an emulator. And it interacts with it just like a real user. So it is super awesome. And how many of you use Detox? Quite a few. OK. So Detox is really cool, and I highly recommend trying that out. What it really does is it emulates a user testing experience for you. And it's very similar to these end-to-end tests that you see for the web. It's super awesome because it is built specially for mobile and React Native, and it works really well. And Detox is not really a black box test. They call themselves as a gray box test. What it does is it allows to test the framework from within the app. So they monitor the app from inside and actually synchronize with it. So this way, it's not super flaky, and you can actually trust the Detox test to do a good job. And what does it do for your team? It saves you tons of time. It helps automate a complete manual QA process, and it saves developers, testers, and everybody else a lot of time. I've noticed that specifically with Detox tests, like everybody who's non-technical loves it on our team, because they can actually see this happening right in front of their eyes. It goes super fast, and it emulates, as I said, the user testing experience. And that is great for people who are non-technical to just look at it and be like, oh, wow, it can do that? That would take me hours to do. And also, it's super simple to write and execute. It's all written in JavaScript. So please do check it out for your integration tests. Basically, testing makes you ship code with a lot of confidence. If you haven't been writing tests, this is a good time to write tests. And you can explore several different options outside of Jest and Detox, and basically make sure that your code is foolproof. All right. So as we talk about testing, and then the next step is continuous delivery. So for continuous delivery, we use a tool called Fastlane. How many of you use Fastlane? A lot of people, awesome. So maybe like 50% uses Fastlane, cool. I love Fastlane. What it does for me is it can distribute beta builds, and that is awesome because I can then add as many testers I want, and they can test my beta versions. And it can also do some of the more monotonous tasks like capture screenshots, code signing, and app store deployment. So these are things that developers kind of hate to do, and Fastlane takes a little bit of burden outside of that from you. And good news is it's cross-platform. It can do both iOS and Android. And tons of hours saved. So I highly recommend checking out Fastlane for your continuous delivery. And using Fastlane, we do our beta deployments so frequently, even like every day or multiple times a day. And for iOS, we use TestFlight. TestFlight is basically an app which can have your beta deployments for iOS. It will have your version numbers for your beta version, and it can have like release notes and things like that. So it is basically almost like an app store experience, but you just install a beta app. And the other one we use for Android is Google Play, and we also use Crashlytics sometimes. So the thing about Google Play is that sometimes for testers, it could get confusing. Are they downloading the prod app or the beta app? So if that kind of confusion needs to be eliminated, you can use Crashlytics as an alternative to deploy your beta for Android. And it is also a product by Google. So it really doesn't make a difference for that. So I've had a good experience with Crashlytics because it also shows me crash reports. You can also check out like how the users are using your app and user retention and other analytics in addition to just using it for installing your beta apps. So check those out for beta deployments. Does anyone use Crashlytics here? Okay, cool. So yeah, definitely check that out for deploying your beta app. All right. The next lesson is picking the right library. We had a whole talk about open source community in React Native, and it is sometimes challenging to pick the right library. So there are several times you may encounter that, hey, I don't think this is available out of the box. These components don't exist. So how do you really pick the right library? The strategy we use is very basic. Look at GitHub, see the number of contributors, look at how active the community is around that library. And of course, some libraries are awesome, but they don't have a lot going on. So if you find libraries like that, you can fork it or be a contributor to it, you know. So it really depends on what you're looking for. There is this React Native community, which has about 70 repositories today, and it is awesome. It is vetted by the leaders of React Native, and it has almost, I think, 50 or 60 contributors. I can't remember the exact number, but it is super awesome. The solutions for like camera, if you want to sound, video, and many other native components that don't exist out of the box are available in React Native community. And again, if you do happen to code your own component, if you're creating solutions today that don't exist, try to open source them and tweet about it and just talk about it a little bit in the community so people are aware of it and it becomes a part of the React Native community. We just want to help each other out here, and that's kind of what you need to do when you're picking the right library. The next lesson is upgrades have been hard in React Native, and everybody who's working on React Native knows that. And obviously, that's also because it's rapidly changing and things are going so fast. It's gonna get better after a few months or few years, but until then, we need to work with what we have. So some tips before you upgrade. Make sure you plan for it. Don't try to do upgrades just when you feel like it or before a prod release and things like that. Always make sure your upgrades are planned well and you have enough padding time to upgrade. In my experience, upgrades have lasted a few hours to a few weeks. Yes, and that's because sometimes, a library you've used may have gotten deprecated. For example, the navigation experimental library I use got deprecated, and I had to rewrite all of that. So just plan ahead of time and The most important thing is upgrade often. If you're going to wait for 6 to 7 months to upgrade, you're going to be having a tough time because React Native changes so rapidly, and you don't want to, wait for too long before you upgrade. So keep up with the latest React Native releases. Just wait for a little bit, make sure everything's stable, and go ahead and upgrade. So we try to keep our app as upgraded as possible, and we do it as often as possible, so we don't run into as many issues as we used to a few years ago. Because we just waited to upgrade, it was just harder back then. And React Native official documentation has steps for upgrading, so you can check that link out, which takes you in the right direction towards upgrading. Finally, about performance, obviously last but not the least, performance is super important for your mobile application. And that's, I would say it's more important for a mobile app to perform better than even a website, because this is something you put on people's phones, and if your application is going to be lagging, doesn't perform well, the users are going to hate it and they're going to uninstall it. So keep in mind that performance is really important, and today we had Ram talk about performance, and he gave a full talk about it. So if you didn't see it, definitely go check it out on YouTube when it's live. Some tips on performance from what we've done in the past. If you're using animations, make sure that you use the prop use native driver and set that to true. That makes a huge difference. It's going to make sure that your animations are running on the native driver instead of the JavaScript side. And we noticed that our animations were lagging and wasn't going as well, especially on Android. And then we realized, hey, we could just use this prop and set that to true, and it made a whole lot of difference. So a simple thing like that really makes a difference because it's going to run on the native side. So keep that in mind. And also, that prop doesn't really work out for layouts. So if you're using Flexbox and position properties, it's not going to work out. But for the most part, your animations can be switched to the native driver. If you're using larger lists, let's say you are having an app like Instagram with a lot of pictures that you need to load, make sure you use the recent components, which is flat list or section list for larger lists. They perform really well in comparison to some of the older components like list view. The reason I'm saying this is when you look into Stack Overflow or other places, some of the code snippets you may come across are older, so make sure you don't use list view, just go for flat list or section list. And if you're using a list, make sure that every item in the list has a key, and this is applicable to React as well. And the reason we need to do that is if you don't have a unique key for every list item, React is going to keep re-rendering every time you add or remove an item. So make sure you have an unique key, and this makes a significant difference in performance. Also, if you're using React class components, make sure that you bind early and render simple. What we mean by that is your bindings need to happen at the constructor level or early on, and your render methods just need to look simple. I don't know if you can see that very well. And the wrong way to do that is to do the binding inside the render method. So that's not how we want to do it. And there are so many other tips. Obviously, performance is a huge aspect. And you can also take a look at the official React Native docs. Talks a lot about performance and different ways to profile and things like that. So keep in mind, your performance of your app is super important. All right, we've reached the end of the lessons, and I'm just going to recap all of them so it stays fresh. Learn React, please. Navigation is at a much better spot today, although it's still evolving. Either go for React Navigation or React Native Navigation. And use state management based on your likes and needs if necessary, if you have a complex application. Expo or not, Expo is great, but does it fit your use case? You have to decide that. Don't treat Android, like a bad person. It's cool. People will be happy if you test it early on. And testing, write unit tests, write integration tests, or as many tests as you can to make your app super solid. Continuous delivery, use Fastlane. I really like it. And picking the right library, pick the right library, and also contribute as much as you can to the community, which is growing. And upgrade often, so you don't complain as much about upgrades, and focus on performance. So that's a recap. And it's a super cool time to be a React Native developer. Things are going so great in the community. It's awesome. And you can see that with all the enthusiasm that's happening at Chain React right here. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much, Chain React, for having me. And if you have any questions, I'm here, or you can even tweet me, whatever. Thank you so much. Thank you.